Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project by Gilbert. Introduction, putting the commune back in communism. There's a growing awareness in our time that the post-capitalist society can only be made by people as a collective project that is neither automatic nor imposed. This, in turn, has contributed to a renewed interest in communes on the part of the left. But while communes today may seem to provide people with an alternative way of living and producing, they are not new. In fact, for much of humanity's past, among diverse social groups, the principal means of production was land, and it belonged to people, not as individuals, but rather to the group, or the commune. In these communities, people's sense of belonging could be profound, so much so that as embedded producers, they considered land to be an extension of their lives and even bodies. However, they did so as a group, meaning that the individuals related to the land by way of the community. The same could be said for the relation that the first craftspeople had their tools and trades. The tools belonged to a community, or to an individual through the community. For example, the Bengali villages that Marx took an interest in. A craftsperson, such as a smith or carpenter, usually possessed the tools of a trade as part of an established role in an agrarian commune, while in much of Europe, there existed guilds that amounted to communities of tradespeople and producers. The epoch of communal production's dominance is long-lasting, for even when original classless communities gave way in most places to pre-capitalist societies divided into classes, the majority of work retained its embedded character. This meant that a bare worker was almost unimaginable. A worker separated and stripped from a communal context defined mainly by shared conditions of work. The profound connectedness of people to their communities and the control they exercised over their shared work conditions meant that only a radical violence could separate them from those contexts. Yet, as we know, that violence occurred wherever capitalism appeared. Marx described the separation with memorable words as a process, dripping from head to toe, from every pore with blood and dirt. From that brutal rupture, modern society emerged, along with modern forms of exploitation and modern individualism and other features that we associate with the capital system. Much was destroyed as a result of this violent process, and much was lost. Nevertheless, there were significant horizons of human development that eventually arose under the social formations of the capital system, formations in which abstract economic relations more than personal ones ruled people's lives. These new horizons were especially important in the sense of breaking down barriers and overcoming, albeit in a highly unequal manner, the limited sets of needs and satisfactions under which people had formerly lived when in traditional communes. Today, however, there is no denying the destruction of the natural environment and of human beings that the capital system has brought, where all is subordinated to an inexorable process of economic valorization that amounts to a virtual treadmill of senseless expansion. This process, far from abating, presses forward in our time with even greater aggressiveness, with new forms of capital accumulation that prey on spheres of life previously outside of capitalism's reach. By contrast, communal systems are more sustainable, less destructive and alienating, and, in many senses, more humanly gratifying. For these reasons, they form an attractive reference, which may seem to be an inspiring alternative in the face of the capital system. That said, the communal way of life lies far in the past for most of us, and it was sometimes the locus of traditional forms of oppression. What to do then? What is the solution to our dilemma? What futures can we aspire to at the current crossroads that humanity faces? Are we condemned forever to live with the current alienating, exploiting, and nature-destroying system that has reached across the globe? Or should we try to recover the communal form of production and life? Hence, our options may seem to be between present-day capitalism and what is, for most people, a historically distant communalism. However, presented as the option of choosing between the undesirable, capitalist progress, and the almost impossible, return, the question is badly posed. In fact, A revolutionary solution to the dire problems that capitalism has brought will not involve rewinding the clock entirely, but rather reaching back with a critical vision to recover those elements of communal systems, especially living and working in communal and classless societies that can point to a future in which human beings enjoy self-determined, more sustainable, and fuller lives. But it is not only about recovery. The use of the communal form today, its adoption, should take place through a dialectical reappropriation of the past in which modern horizons of personal freedom and cultural diversity are preserved, and some of capitalism's technological advances are employed within a democratic approach to production and life that is rational, sustainable, and beneficial to both human beings and the natural environment. This book is about that complex project of human emancipation and preservation of the Earth system. It is about communal socialism, or modern socialism using the commune as a building block. It looks at that project as it took root in a small corner of the world, in Venezuela, where today, as a result of the process of national liberation that began 2 decades ago, there is a contemporary effort at socialist construction based on the communal form, taking its lead from important precedents both in Latin American history and in revolutionary theory, especially that of Karl Marx. Specifically, the book tells the story of how the Venezuelan people, along with a remarkable leader named Hugo Chavez, seized on and interpreted the project of advancing toward a better future based on the commune as a socialist building block. The book looks at steps that Venezuelan communities have taken in our time, first steps for now, taken in very difficult conditions, and the ideas and projects they have developed. It is the belief of many of us, both inside and outside Venezuela's communal movement, that these small steps are of great importance to humanity as a whole. The essence of the commune. Why build a commune? What are the advantages of the communal system? When you visit an urban commune these days in Venezuela, you might encounter various workshops and other spaces for production. Or if it's a rural commune, there will be fields with crops and maybe livestock. Along with this, there will be meeting spaces and residences that surround the commune. People might seem happier or more relaxed than normal, but perhaps not. Indeed, many people will be engaged in work or leisure activities that are similar to those one sees everywhere in the capitalist world. So, what is the essence of the commune in all of this? In fact, what Bertolt Brecht said about a factory, that from the outside you cannot tell much about the real social relations, capitalist or socialist, operating there, applies to what you can see in a Venezuelan commune. The essence of a commune is a new set of social relations, which are usually not immediately visible. The most important of these, and a necessary feature of the communal system, as it existed before and might exist in the future, is directly social labor. What is directly social labor in this context? Briefly, it means labor activities that are carried out in the name of goals and with methods that the community itself decides. This is not very mysterious, for in today's world there's an ample array of labor activities that are still carried out with a direct interpersonal goal in mind. That is, whose social character is not mediated by commodity exchange. These include much of care work, domestic labor, and subsistence activities, the various forms of work sometimes described as social reproductive labor. This kind of labor, despite the oppressive context in which it's often carried out, is usually done with the goal of helping or catering for people and not for money or exchange. However, labor that is paid and considered productive for society at large, the more recognized and visible forms of labor, is a different matter. This kind of labor, which is decisive in our society, is not directly social at all because, as private production, its social character is mediated by the exchange of commodities. This means that it becomes social only after being crystallized in a product that passes through the circuit of exchange, that is, after it acquires the form of value. The mediation of labor activities and exchange by value-bearing commodities is enough to interpret labor's directly social character, concealing the laborer behind fetishized commodities. But there is more to the strange circuits of production that operate in our economies. That is because, in our societies, labor power itself has become a commodity through the wage system. Hence, even if there's much concrete, non-alienated, but undervalued and unpaid labor dedicated to reproducing life in our time, this is only half the story. A huge range of labor processes, namely those that incorporate commodified wage labor, involve conditions such as tools, machinery, and technology that are separated from the worker. They are owned and controlled by someone else, while the worker now simply works to earn a living. This scenario overturns centuries of traditional practices, and it results in a situation where not only do work conditions come to confront workers as something alien, separated from them, but even work activities themselves become external, imposed, and threatening to workers. These activities, which become a mere job, no longer belong to the worker, nor does the product. Moreover, the labor process ceases to be under the worker's control. The inexorable imperative to make profit, which dominates and determines the labor process from beginning to end, means that, in a sense, no one is in control. A good parable for this condition, one that Marx and Engels referred to in the Communist Manifesto, is found in J.W. von Goethe's poem
Der Zauberlehrling,
made popular as the Sorcerer's Apprentice sequence in Disney's 1940 film Fantasia. In Goethe's poem, a bewitched broom, which can be taken to refer to work that is no longer under human control, as in the capital system, with its imperative to accumulate, does the work for an apprentice. The magical broom begins to fill bucket after bucket of water. This seems good at first, but the unstoppable and automatic bucket brigade that the apprentice has conjured into being soon leads to dangerous flooding. In our society, we are living in that flood, that debacle. And what we are living is only the beginning of it. The natural conditions for life on the planet are being destroyed as they risk reaching points of no return, as is evident in the reports that scientists regularly develop and diffuse only to have politicians ignore them. Meanwhile, a human being stretched on the rack of alienated labor, making good on the etymological connection between labor and torture so common in Romance languages, risks being carried away by the uncontrollable tide. The formerly charmed use of alienated labor, which might once have seemed beneficial and innocent, now shows its dangerous, destructive, and even demonic face. In sharp contrast, the communal system, as it is being pursued in Venezuela, promises to put the brooms back into the hands of the people themselves and their communities. It proposes to restore labor conditions and instruments to freely associated producers who will decide how to use and control them, thereby de-alienating these producers' labor, and at the same time allow for the liberation of the undervalued, often coerced work of social reproduction by making it shared and collective. The most important transformation in the communal system that is taking shape today in the country, though mainly in the grassroots, is that it would put all labor once again under democratic and direct social control, since in this new way of producing there would no longer be labor activities that become social only post festum, that is, only through the ricochet of products in the market. The bizarre break between production and consumption that exists under the capital system, in which commodities make their daily leap into the void of the market as exchange values, would be overcome. Production of use values would be reconnected to consumption and real needs, which would become communal consumption for that reason. In this new society, freed from the necessity of producing exchange values, reproducing life in its rich and diverse manifestations, and the community's well-being would be the priorities, not capital accumulation. There would be no automatic process of valorization, no senseless treadmill. Freed from the constraints of value production, the society of associated producers brought together in communes of different kinds, could dispose of time according to self-determined aims, with a view to expanding individual free time and promoting all-round human development in a way that is harmonious with the natural environment. Ending the tyranny of value production would also allow productive and reproductive or household work to be equally valued and bring an end to the capital system's historic separation of these two spheres. These are the merits of the communal format. Moreover, whatever virtues the capital system had, which mainly consists in the expansion of human horizons that occurred under its reign, would have to be incorporated into the new society. Likewise, in the new communal system, technological innovation and the resulting productivity would exist in a different, more manageable form. It would be manageable inasmuch as the expansiveness that is uncontrollable or automatic is impossible by definition under a regime of directly social labor. Genesis of the communal project in Venezuela. In Venezuela, the project of building socialism through a communal system emerged out of a complex historical process. Despite this complexity, it is easy to trace how the first ideals and principles that guided the Bolivarian Revolution when it emerged at the turn of the century were taken up and continued in the subsequent communal project. From the beginning, this political movement defended participative and protagonistic democracy, which was expressed in a range of documents, including some before taking power, and also practices. The latter included massive direct participation in the Constitutional Assembly of 1999 and subsequent referendums, 1999, 2004, 2007, but also the various community organizations Chávez's government promoted that were expressions of popular power. Most notable among these were the community councils that emerged in 2005, along with the technical water forums, Mesas Técnicas de Agua, and urban land communities, Comités de Tierra Urbana, all of them aimed at establishing democratic control from the grassroots. In the second part of the decade, the Bolivarian Revolution's commitment to participative and protagonistic democracy would continue in different guises as a regulative ideal, finally issuing into the Commune. This occurred through a more or less logical unfolding of the basic principle of democratic self-emancipation. An important step took place in 2006 when the country's project, which had been defined by expanding grassroots democracy and anti-imperialism, now morphed into the project of socialism, which Chávez called democracy squared. Next, after a brief flirtation with some more top-down models and after the slap in the face the government received in 2007 with a vote against the constitutional reform, the country's model became communal socialism, or socialism by way of the commune as a basic cell. This occurred in 2009, with the Law of Communes being developed a year later. The Law of Communes was in many ways a high watermark as far as governmental programs and projects were concerned. It was passed in a packet of laws, the Popular Power Laws, at a time when Chávez's government, because of the torrential rains and flooding that occurred at the end of 2010, had been granted the power to legislate by decree. The government wasted no time in generating 5 laws on the themes of popular power, communes, and the communal economy. These laws laid out the basic structural model for Venezuelan communes as instances of grassroots political and economic democracy, which were to be built by joining community councils and other popular organizations in a zone. The popular power laws were very thorough ones, promulgating communal planning, communal cities, federations of communes, and even the communal state. Most important, they called for a profound transformation of productive relations. Article 12 of the Law of the Communal Economic System describes those new relations as, quote, a production model based on social property, oriented towards eliminating the social division of labor that is typical of the capitalist model, unquote. The article also made clear the overall goal. Quote, the socialist production model is aimed at satisfying the growing needs of the population through new forms of creation and appropriation, end quote. These laws left little to be desired as far as the main features of socialist communes are concerned. They ratified the importance of non-alienating work, collective property, production focused on use values, and satisfying the expanding needs of the population while addressing the question of social use of the economic surplus. These laws also had special provisions for indigenous communes. These vanguard laws, which had their roots in the movement's long-standing commitment to participative grassroots democracy, even pointed to an overcoming or transformation of the state, as is indicated not only by the implicit class position of the project of building socialism from below, but also by their references to a future communal state. To some, it might seem strange that one would try to legislate revolution in this way, and indeed, the whole question connects with the complex relation between state power and social revolution that will come up at various points in this book. However, the popular power laws were different from most laws that operate in capitalist states in that they were aimed at empowering those from below, who would therefore have to assume responsibility for the laws and bring them to realization. It was precisely for this reason that, after the communal path was made official, Chavez began his usual process of persuading people to participate in and deepen the revolution from the bully pulpit he had developed as the revolution's communicator-in-chief. Chavez had done so before with the cooperatives and the community councils, along with other government initiatives. Now, however, his discursive work took the form of explaining and encouraging people to go forward and build communes. He explained most features of the communal project very carefully in the television program Allo Presidente Teórico Número Uno. Chavez said that the commune would be a heroic construction carried out by the masses, and also the place where socialism would be born. He subsequently outlined the ethical, economic, and political dimensions of the project, while warning about the importance of communes maintaining autonomy from the newly founded PSUV party, United Socialist Party of Venezuela. The communal project, as a strategic horizon, would be ratified over the upcoming years in various discourses and writings, even if fewer steps were taken on the ground that could have been desired. The project received its most significant endorsement in Chavez's last important speech, Strike at the Helm, where the president articulated the slogan that has since become the rallying cry of the country's communal movement, Commune or Nothing. Vicissitudes of the communal project. The project by which Venezuela arrived at communal socialism as a societal project can be presented, as we have done just now, according to a linear, step-by-step narrative. It can be seen as the logical upshoot of a revolutionary process and its principles, mainly grassroots democracy, which reached their organic culmination in the project of communal socialism. However, to do so risks ignoring some notable obstacles and vicissitudes that the communal project underwent. These are various kinds and include widespread resistance among intellectuals, whose class commitments are evident in their ongoing practice of prioritizing Venezuela's oil preserves rather than its socialism as the bone of contention with imperialism. On top of this, there was a complicated geopolitical context in the continent, with the progressive governments that were once Venezuela's allies losing ground in the face of imperialism's containment tactics, especially the coups the United States promoted in Honduras in 2009 and Paraguay in 2012. These aggressions worked to impede the advance of progressive governments in the region in what has come to be known as the pink tide. This adverse geopolitical situation may go some way to explaining why Chavez, in an apparently contradictory way, deployed so much of the Venezuelan state's resources from 2010 to his death in essentially social relief projects such as the Great Housing Mission, even as he talked about the communal socialism. However, the most important vicissitude the communal project has faced has been served up to it not by foot-dragging intellectuals or the destabilizing hand of imperialism, but by the project's reception in the masses themselves. This is so much so that the overarching story of Venezuelan communes, in concrete terms, is not a linear one, but rather a trajectory that follows a kind of sine wave, dipping to almost zero at one point before rising up at a later time. That is to say, when Chavez launched the idea of making communes in 2009, though there were some notable exceptions, the project generally got little traction in the masses. The overall conjecture, because of the oil-stoked abundance during the commodity supercycle that was occurring then, was adverse to the communal project and actually favored the project of assistantalist social democracy, or the aspiration to build state socialism. The general mood was something like this: why make the sacrifices of a difficult project of building communes when the oil profits were abundant enough to pay off social debt and even solve the riddle of primitive socialist accumulation that, for example, Yevgeny Preobrazhensky and Nikolai Bukharin debated 100 years ago in a state socialist context. This meant that Chavez's idea of communal socialism was an untimely one. To use Nietzsche's phrase, it only found a fertile context at a later date, at a time he could not foresee. That time came only after Chavez's death, and well after the economy had taken a sharp downturn, which put the Venezuelan people through one of the worst trials by fire ever in Latin American history. After Chavez died, the new government, led by Chavez's named successor, Nicolás Maduro, faced severe economic crisis and heightened imperialist assaults expressed in cruel sanctions and various coup attempts. The government responded with overt pragmatism. It pursued an essentially capitalist path of least resistance that meant turning away from socialism and even grassroots democracy, and a fortiori putting the commune on the furthest of backburners. Price controls were eliminated, real wages reduced, and social programs defunded. Now, between imperialist attacks, economic downturn, and eternally imposed shock therapy, the wonderful abundance that Venezuelans had lived through in the first decade of the century dissipated like the morning haze when the sun rises. It was the worst of times. A moment when the average Venezuelan lost 22 pounds, desperate immigration destroyed families, and the government's iron-fisted attitude towards hunger-driven misdemeanors left thousands of youths dead in the barrios. Yet in this extremely bleak situation, the communal ideal began to shine again. Quietly and unbeknownst to most urban residents and to the navel-gazing bureaucrats, the communal project had been assumed by small groups of people around the country, not only as a solution to the problems they faced, but also as a way of restoring Chavismo to what they understood to be its original path and project. That meant that the worst of times was also the best of times, for socialism and the communes at least. It was the time when the rural El Maizal commune began to seize land in Lara state, when the Andean Che Guevara commune began to buckle down and recover cooperative coffee growing and processing in its fertile hillsides, and the flagship urban commune El Panel set about expanding by building panalito modules throughout the west of Caracas. In effect, an idea that had fallen on sterile ground when originally proposed now began to take root. There was a small but growing group of robust communes in the country and a much wider web of communal projects that were taking their first steps. Moreover, they had an objective going further. Cida Pascual Marquina and I, residents in Venezuela and participants in the Bolivarian process since 2006, tried to capture the spirit of this moment in our 2020 book, Venezuela, the Present as Struggle, which documents how a kind of consensus emerged in the grassroots regarding a left solution to the country's crisis. Through numerous interviews carried out in 2018 and 2019, we were able to ascertain how the Chavista Socialist Project, far from disappearing during the crisis, had simply burrowed underground. It had survived in the masses. The ideals of popular power, participative and protagonistic democracy, and also communal socialism were maintained in the grassroots. The practical-minded government might have backburnered these projects, but the masses had not. Self-critically, we realized that we too had not fully understood the importance of the commune, both as a project and a reality operating in the grassroots, and were therefore not immune to the myopia of the progressive intellectuals mentioned above. In response, we began to make up for lost time with a crash course on the communes as they exist and operate around the country. This new book, Commune or Nothing, is in great measure both a reflection of this process of self-education and an effort to make it available to others. Our first attempt to really get to know the country's communes was a trip to El Maisal commune in Lara State, which is chronicled in chapter 1 of this book. To our pleasant surprise, we saw that the main Chavista ideals and a revolutionary horizon, though more or less abandoned in official spheres, were alive and well in this rural redoubt. A light bulb turned on, spurring a desire to go on investigating. Next was a revelatory trip to the Che Guevara commune in the foothills of the Venezuelan Andes, which is presented in chapter 3. Then came an investigation of 3 communes, Luisa Cárceres, Monte Sinai, and Cinco Fortalezas in eastern Venezuela, chapter 5, and participation in the foundational congress in the nascent Communal Union. Subsequently, we visited the self-managed Indorca metallurgy workshop in Bolivar State, which is not technically a commune, but operates with much the same spirit and has a volunteer brigade, the Productive Workers' Army, that has worked with several communes. Chapter 7. Last but not least, we investigated El Panel commune, which is right under our noses at just a few metro stops from where we live in Caracas. By the time the investigation was coming to a provisional close, a happy coincidence would have it that a new interest in the communes was being widely felt among Venezuelan intellectuals, grassroots leaders, and even the government itself. In a surprising about-face, President Maduro called for 2023 to be the year of the communes and insisted that everything that needed to be changed would be changed. Clearly, there was a new wind blowing, a new optimism, and a widely felt sense that the communal project was something emergent that was perhaps capable of re-hegemonizing the Bolivarian process and redirecting it to socialism. Future readers, though not too far in the future since Venezuelan history moves so fast, will be able to judge for themselves whether this hope, which is expressed so frequently in these pages, has come to pass and brought with it both a change of power relations in the country's governmental spheres and a shift towards socialism in the economy. Marx and communes. Marx famously wrote that communism was not an ideal to be imposed on reality, but rather the real movement that abolished the present state of things. He meant that by the real social and historical movement, which he next clarified as resulting from conditions now in existence, it is clear that the real historical movement of emancipation has led Venezuelan revolutionaries along the tortuous path sketched above to the commune as a building block of socialism. Nevertheless, the commune's role in socialism also has a solid theoretical basis in revolutionary theory. If chapter 2 of this book combines a look at the long roots of the Venezuelan communal system in the region's indigenous, maroon, and peasant communities, along with its basis in Latin American Marxism, then chapter 4 explores some of the project's underpinning in recent Marxian theory. However, the commune also played a central role in the thought of Marx himself, though its centrality has long been under-recognized. This is so much so that much of what the Venezuelan people did in the early 21st century was simply to restore Marxism to its original proposals, though these were mostly buried under the detritus of false doctrine. This recovery of original Marxism that happened in Venezuela, which I like to call putting the commune back into communism, has to do with both the commune as the organizational format or building block of socialism and the democratic, self-organized means of getting there. Regarding the format, many have commented on Marx's reticence about the future emancipated society that could replace capitalism. Various explanations have been given, such as Marx's lack of time or the underdeveloped nature of the capitalism he studied. It is clearly the case that one cannot find in Marx's work a thorough description of socialist or communist society. Commentators are undoubtedly correct about this. Still, just as salient as this absence is the remarkable lack of commentary about the lines that actually do appear, and do so repeatedly, in Marx's writings about a society of freely associated producers, in such central works as the Communist Manifesto and Capital. These are clearly references to the post-capitalist emancipated society that he envisioned and felt was imminent in the existing one. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels project a society based on association in which, quote, the free development of each is the condition for the development of all, unquote. while no less than 8 times does Marx refer to freely associated producers, or variations on that phrase in the 3 volumes of Capital. What kind of post-capitalist society is being referred to here? Freely associated producers, or freely associated people, is not an empty phrase or mere revolutionary rhetoric. That is, words that sound good and maybe inspire people to struggle. First of all, it refers to how those who actually produce, not their bosses, whether private executives or state bureaucrats, must associate themselves, not, therefore, have abstract collectivization imposed on them. Further, it projects a situation where these producers operate as free and self-determined agents. This means that their activities are not determined by economic forces or the law of value, nor are they controlled by some external agency, either patriarchal or paternalistic, or even by an externally imposed production plan. Hence, the phrase is an almost undeniable reference to producers being organized in communes. Where else can one produce in free association and rule oneself? Where else can useful and enjoyable activities be coordinated without being mediated by the exchange of things? These references to freely associated production resonate with Marx's claims in his 1857-58
Grundrisse,
manuscript, which in some ways his most comprehensive work. There, Marx not only consistently describes community production as the original condition for historical development, communal property is the point of departure of all cultured peoples, he writes, but he comes full circle and declares it to be the goal. This is evident when Marx affirms that the perfection is found in voluntary associations, and refers to the new society that could emerge after capitalism as one with a communal character of production, where there is an exchange of activities determined by communal needs and purposes. Further evidence for Marx's wagering on the Commune comes from how he not only supported the Paris Commune of 1871, but pronounced it to be the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. Almost 10 years later, and near the end of his life, Marx ratified the possibility of using the peasant commune, as it persisted in the Russian countryside, as a springboard for socialist development in his much celebrated letter and drafts to Vera Zasulich. So much, then, for the relevance of the commune to the project of building the post-capitalist society. It is clearly a format that, if employed consciously and in dialogue with modern development, Marx thought could transform existing social relations from bottom to top, thereby building socialism. What about the methods of organization used to build communes? Is socialist emancipation the task of some enlightened group, institution, or individual who might impose their projects on the passive masses? As is well known, but seemingly just as easily forgotten, this was an idea that Marx rejected in the utopian socialists from the beginning, and also manifested in his dislike of Ferdinand Lassalle's state-friendly and leader-centric approach to socialism. Marx always held that the human being was the subject and not the predicate of change, and therefore defended self-emancipation. Nevertheless, a kind of substitutionist vanguardism as a means for socialist construction, even vanguardism with an authoritarian turn, has persisted as a model up to the present. The story of 20th century socialism is largely one of how a state party vanguardism, misbranded as Leninism, was consolidated through a complicated process in which no one individual can be blamed, as socialist orthodoxy. Yet this orthodoxy, essentially the idea that the state and party can conduct the socialist project, which is in turn conceived as a command economy with the masses cast in the role of beneficiaries, is outright revisionism. It replicates the subject-predicate inversion that Marx opposed, and results in no more than another form of extracting surplus labor from above in an economy in which the labor processes are not controlled by direct producers. Marx, from the beginning, was committed to the conscious self-emancipation of the working class, and he did so not for sentimental reasons, but because anything else was a contradiction in terms when the issue is people becoming full and active subjects. Self-emancipation was a paradigm that Marx put forth first at age 25 in a letter to Arnold Ruge, and he never abandoned it. This means that when the Venezuelan people, who, for reasons of history, have long been committed to grassroots democracy, have rebelled on numerous occasions in its name, turned to the communal paradigm, and proposed to build their communes via a process of self-emancipation, with themselves as protagonists, they were simply recovering this original but repeatedly sidelined socialist and Marxist idea as part of their ongoing project of emancipation through profoundly democratic means. Experience and study had taught them that the overall social metabolism was the most important thing to change, and only by altering it under the aegis of a transformed state apparatus could they eventually overcome the whole capital system. Doing so would be no easy task, and yet a people who had such a long trajectory of rebellion, with Venezuelans serving as the vanguard of the independence struggle 200 years ago, and being engaged in a more or less constant state of social insurgency ever since, were willing to take up the gauntlet. They faced the challenge in the spirit of a do-or-die struggle, which came to be known as the battle for their second and final independence. Existential options. The idea of an all-or-nothing existential struggle for socialism is expressed in the slogan that was chosen as the title for this work, Commune or Nothing. That slogan is the main battle cry of Venezuela's communal movement today, and one hears it constantly in the mouths of communard militants and leaders. State officials, too, must appeal to it whenever they attempt to reach out to the communal movement. The phrase has important precedence in both the Cuban slogan, Patria o Muerte, country or death, and in Rosa Luxemburg's socialism or barbarism, with which it resonates because it juxtaposes two polar opposites as alternatives. In the history of the Bolivarian process, one can trace how heroic slogans of this kind, slogans that clearly express the existential alternatives at stake in the project of emancipation, were used early on, then faded away, only to be recovered in this new slogan. That is to say, for the first half-decade or so of the Bolivarian process, Patria o Muerte and independence, socialism, or death circulated widely. Then, around 2007, came a time of retreat, when the overall tone of the process shifted to a more affirmative mode, and the dominant slogans became ones like Viviremos y venceremos, we will live and we will win, Patria, Socialismo y Vida, country, socialism, and life. In effect, negation, an important part of Marxian dialectics and its revolutionary worldview, had been erased from the Bolivarian process's imagery, and had the possibility expressed in the Communist Manifesto, and truer than ever in our time, that the outcome of class struggle could be mutual destruction, instead of one class defeating the other. Yet there is more to tell here. The story of how Chavez abandoned these more affirmative and bland slogans and then finally returned with the enunciation of commune or nothing to a vision that accounted for the true nature of the challenges and risks facing humanity has been recovered in an investigation by Venezuelan intellectual Reynaldo Iturriza. The period he looks at is Chavez's last years of life, which were marked by an awareness that he had contracted an aggressive cancer, imbuing him with a sense of urgency. Over the course of his last year, Chavez became aware that the communal project had not really taken root in a concrete way in the masses, nor had it been embedded fully by its ministerial cabinet. During his last cabinet meeting in October 2012, this is what made Chavez angrily ask his ministers the pointed questions. Where is the commune? Where are these so-called communes in construction? The discourse he gave in that meeting, which became known as Golpe de Timón, strike at the helm, constitutes the one and only moment where Chavez would say, commune or nothing. The phrase is not only important because Chavez thought of it, but also because it struck home and later went viral. The backstory that Iturriza has uncovered is that Chavez had been reading Friedrich Nietzsche during his illness, the sarcoma that was first discovered in 2011. As Iturriza points out, Chavez read Nietzsche in a very personal way, with a particular interest in the figure of the child that appears in Thus Spake Zarathustra, who, as a creative spirit, is meant to supersede the camel, a beast of burden, and the lion, which stands for conflict and overcoming. However, Chavez was also fascinated by the concept of nihilism, the existential option that Nietzsche sometimes described as willing nothing. As luck would have it, Chavez had attended a military event in January 2011 where he heard an officer use the phrase, independence or nothing, attributing it to Bolivar. Hearing these words of Bolivar's made something click in the president. Chavez, who knew the history of the independence like the back of his hand, was taken aback that he had never heard the slogan before. He started to incorporate independence or nothing as a slogan in his speeches and simultaneously began to identify his contender in the presidential elections of 2012, Henry Capriles, and the right-wing opposition more generally with nothing, la nada, that is, with the nihilistic option and with the abyss. Chavez's identifying the opposition with a nihilistic abyss was because he felt that an opposition government would leave the country with no future. He made this clear when saying that the opposition, quote, represented what is called nihilism, nothing. They are the negation of everything. The claim that Venezuela was involved in an existential struggle in which the whole of humanity and its future was at stake was latent in Chavez's speeches and thinking throughout that last year. Implicitly, advancing towards socialism by way of the Commune, the project he had proposed 3 years earlier, came to be understood as the only alternative to the nihilistic abyss. However, it was only once in the Golpe de Timón speech that Chavez actually riffed on Bolivar's phrase to obtain the Commune or nothing slogan. It was a unique utterance, but one heard around the world. With this slogan, which connects the history of socialism with that of independence, touching along the way upon existential philosophy, Chavez wove together the aspiration of national liberation with the socialist project and the future of humanity. The Commune was the Archimedean point, or crossroads, where all of it came together. A date with history. A word should be said about Romanticism, which, in the sense of a past-oriented worldview, is clearly present in Venezuela's communal project, with its significant nods toward the idea of reappropriating a historically sidelined way of life, specifically the communal form of social organization in present-day circumstances. This book reflects that project in both its content and style. Indeed, in the pages that follow, I frequently allude to breaches or jumps in the continuum of time, straying far from the model of Cartesian linearity and the progressive view of history. This approach, call it revolutionary romanticism, which is fundamental to the Venezuelan practice of socialist construction, needs to be distinguished both from the naive romanticism that dreams of the simple life and from the reactionary romanticism that approaches the past uncritically while rejecting the emancipatory horizons and aspirations that emerged under modernity. Admittedly, aspirations that usually remain unfulfilled. This approach to the past could seem exotic if it were not so much a part of popular consciousness in Venezuela. In fact, both Chavez and the wider militancy of the Bolivarian process relied on a conception of time that is made up of strange twists and turns that, like wormholes, connect past and present struggles. In this worldview, an opening in the present could lead us to a goldmine of the past, from which a revolutionary vein of ideas and a stream of living memory could emerge from the catacombs of history and legend into a revolutionary present. This is what Chavez did with historical personages such as Simón Bolívar, Manuela Sáenz, Ezequiel Zamora, Juana la Avanzadora Ramírez, Simón Rodríguez, Samuel Robinson, and others that make up Venezuela's combative past. These figures made their tiger's leap, to use the phrase of revolutionary romantic Walter Benjamin, into the 21st century. The idea was to open a space of untold possibilities, a Jetztzeit, or moment of revolutionary praxis, through which an incomplete historical project could take life and move forward in the present. Something similar could be said of the idea of the Commune. It is clearly part of a past that is not too distant for much of Venezuela, where significant numbers of indigenous people live even now in communal form, while elements of African, indigenous, and peasant communal cultures survive, though sometimes only latently in the society. These cultures and traditions, past and present, embody a more sustainable, less alienated, and in many ways freer mode of living and producing. This means that either as present-day practices or latent memories, such communal traditions and modes of life can and should be made to form part of commune building today. They have a central role to play in the project of a revolutionary opening onto the future that is partly inspired by them. At the same time, the name of the revolutionary reappropriation of the communal model must be, as Marx consistently insisted right up through his last writings, one that involves not a mere return to the traditional or historical commune, as some Russian populists proposed in the 19th century, but the critical use and adaptation of it in the present-day modern context. Most especially, the contemporary use of the commune must be one that allows for developing free individuality, the basis of which was laid through the expansion of needs, aspirations, and satisfactions that emerged as possibilities over the course of modern class struggle. Fortunately, this approach is basic to the thinking of Venezuelan communards. For example, when we encounter a communard leader, Robert Lonja, in the upcoming pages, he will emphasize that his organization, in constructing El Panel, is adapting the commune, updating and actualizing it for present circumstances. This is important, among other reasons, because oppressive power relations, including patriarchal, racial, cis-heteronormative, and caste-based forms of domination, were sometimes part of the fabric of historical communes and the traditional societies where they existed. Communal socialism cannot accept this. It must seek complete emancipation. The left has a mixed track record on these issues, and it would be unacceptable for communal socialism to repeat the errors of 20th century socialism by failing to overcome the range of oppressions that form part of the capital system, even if they preceded it. Correctly understood, the legacy of the varied projects that composed the short century of really existing socialism is that they were not too radical, but not radical enough, insofar as they did not end such oppressions, or made the empty gesture of postponing their overcoming to some later stage. On a superficial level, communal socialism risks being no exception to this historical tendency, because of the patriarchal and other kinds of oppressive social relations that were built into many historical communes and communities. Indeed, the communal form, as a basic building block for socialism, runs the risk of preserving such injustices if it is appropriated in a reactionary way. However, it is just as true that communes, if appropriated in a revolutionary way, have the potential to abolish the whole gamut of social oppressions. They, in fact, hold the promise of building a stronger, more radical, and more emancipatory socialism. The reason for this is that the communal form, precisely because it embraces the totality of social existence and proposes to reintegrate productive and reproductive activities into a democratically organized whole, has the potential to transform the full range of social relations that exist in our society and thus eradicate the entire constellation of oppressions, including sexual, gender, racial, colonial, and political oppressions that, together with the economic exploitation, make up today's patriarchal racial capitalism. In a basic sense, this emancipatory promise has to do with how communal socialism, through the radical transformations that issue from overcoming the straitjacket of value production, permits us to avoid the typical limitations of historical socialism. Too often, the socialist project was reduced to a scenario in which male wage laborers combated exploitation, essentially seeking a fairer distribution of wealth, while domestic relations and forms of oppression that existed in the sphere were left intact. Historical socialism had that crucial limitation. It allowed household labor and other social reproductive activities, labor that has generally fallen on women and racialized people from at least the mid-19th century forward, to be bracketed off by mainstream socialist discourse and practice. As Marxist feminists such as Margaret Benson and Lise Vogel have shown, this approach overlooks how, in a profound and structural sense, oppression in the domestic sphere supports the totality of the system through capitalism's externalizing of reproductive labor, the work that reproduces labor power into a separate but connected sphere. By contrast, the communal model, when assumed in revolutionary projects today, has the potential to disallow such a division. This is because a revolutionary commune, through its cohesive approach to work and life and its integrating of communal consumption with communal production, makes this kind of division and bracketing off impossible. The revolutionary commune means emancipation for all or none. However, it should go without saying that realizing this potential depends on the socialist commune being a construction, a heroic one at that, not merely an inheritance of pre-existing communal relations that are themselves sometimes tainted by the patriarchal and other forms of oppression. A modern socialist commune has to be shaped by the emancipatory projects expressed in powerful social movements in our time, prominent among these being feminism, LGBTQIA+ movements, and anti-racism. In fact, it follows from socialist communes being expressions of freely associated labor that they will be feminist, anti-racist, and welcoming of gender diversity. In Venezuela, this is borne out by the concrete practice of commune building in the country for, as will be noted in the pages that follow, its communes provide spaces where relations and identities are in constant construction, and women and members of the country's black and brown majority populations are the main protagonists in the project. There has been a turning of tables, if still incomplete, of existing power relations, while one also sees how reproductive work has begun to be more fully socialized, public and shared in the communes, though generally in a more spontaneous than planned manner. Learning along the way. This isn't a book about explaining the communes from an all-knowing perspective. Doing so would be impossible given the nature of its object of study. Socialist construction, which is an ongoing process in Venezuela, is always something that necessitates thinking along the way and working things out downstream. Likewise, charting its moving targets requires feedback based on a self-critical assimilation of experiences, drawing on both errors and partial successes. Marx himself said that the educator needs to be educated, and he thought that would happen through revolutionary praxis. This Marxist principle applies to Venezuela today, where commune building as revolutionary practice is nothing if not a process of self-education. And it makes sense that learning and writing about communes would have some of the same character. For that reason, what I propose to do in the pages that follow is mostly to accompany the reader in a process of discovery that in some way parallels the open-ended process of construction that Venezuelan revolutionaries are still working their way through today. Reality, especially when human praxis is involved, consists of processes that are complex, multi-level, and dialectic, and so must be its reflection. In that spirit, the chapters of this book, some of the preliminary versions of which were published as independent essays, try to weave together theory and observation in the tradition of materialism as expressed not only by Marx and Engels in such marvelous works as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and The Condition of the Working Class in England, but also William Hinton's books Fanshin and Shenfan, which document the Chinese Revolution on the level of village life, to mention some very diverse but real sources of inspiration. The idea is to have parallel threads of discourse, such as human stories, economic and political analysis, and even geography, that complement and enrich each other. For the most part, the truths or conclusions that the book deals with are not presented beforehand, but rather discovered along the way in a process that readers can accompany. This means that the best arguments one will encounter in the following pages are concrete realities, not a priori demonstrations. Here we will learn from what has been done, and what is being done, often on a small scale and in the face of many challenges, in communal experiments that are necessarily imperfect because they carry the baggage of the past with them. a baggage that will only be left behind with time and self-critical practice. There are hundreds of active communes that exist in Venezuela, but instead of approaching the subject in terms of generalities, we will attempt to penetrate the topic of communal construction by focusing in depth on just a handful of communes, either because they are the most developed and advanced ones or are representative for some other reason. The idea is to open a window on what is happening on the ground in a concrete sense. Hence, we will get a front row seat on learning processes, but we won't have definitive or final answers that neither the communards themselves nor the studious and inventive Chavez who inspired them had either. This is about learning and accompanying a movement characterized by the diversity of its elements and its decentralized nature. Perhaps that is why I found the Chronicle to be the most apt literary form to approach the subject in the chapters that deal with the specific communes. The Chronicle format also allowed me to capture another important reality, that the investigation and writing of this book was carried out in the middle of a pandemic and severe economic crisis, with the U.S. sanctions making life extremely difficult for Venezuelans, and, almost needless to say, making travel difficult for investigators. Finally, I should point out that there's some inevitable ambiguity in the authorial voice used throughout the book. Sometimes we is used and sometimes I. While the authorship of many ideas or appreciations seem to emerge from the spaces between individuals, whether communard or investigator, questioner or respondent, on one level this can be explained because the subject that was learning and assimilating the experiences was a collective one. The investigative trips that took me to different communes in Venezuela's vast territory over the course of 2 years were always group undertakings. While many of the observations presented in the book were debated and reflected upon with friends and colleagues. By far the most important of these interlocutors, who was a constant presence in the investigation and writing of this work, is Cira Pascual Marquina, who contributed to its framing and production immeasurably. On another level, the slippage between plural and singular first-person voice used in the book and the ambiguities that result can function as a stand-in for the communal subject, the open-ended and expanding subject of change so necessary for our time. It can remind us that neither a communist nor a communard is ever alone.